behalf of the Sundays at 2 committee, I'd like to welcome you for today's presentation. A few admin things before we do so. There are bathrooms located in the back as well as downstairs if you need that. We'll be having coffee and cookies after the presentation, and Dr. Burton will be staying to be available to answer any additional questions that you might have. I'd also like to call your attention to the remaining programs that we have in the Sundays at 2 program. Next Sunday, we'll have Carolyn Quinn from Duggan Farms. On March 12th, we'll have Joshua Sherman talking about electric vehicles and the future of that. And on March 19th, we'll have Julian Patterson, who is a global and local entrepreneur. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Edwin Burton. One of the things, he's got multiple degrees. He's spent the vast majority of his adult life teaching, but he's also been always working while he was teaching. So he brings that unique combination of practical experience on Wall Street as well as extensive academic experience. And we have some of his more recent articles in the back as you would like. Without any further ado, because I know he has a whole lot to share with us, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Edwin Burton.
Just like to figure out how to use this. Can you hear me if I use this like this? Can you hear me fine? Can y'all hear me in the back?
Yes.
How about y'all? Is it too loud? No, it's okay. Before I get started, I want to thank the committee for, I kind of pushed the committees because I wanted to do this. So I'm very excited to be here. It's a great honor to be here. My family has lived in this community now for almost 6 years, but I'm still working at the University of Virginia, so we're kind of half here and half in Charlottesville. Still, I don't think I'm ever going to retire, although people say I should have retired 30 years ago. My students say that all the time, but I think I'll keep doing it. Before I get started, there are a couple of people here in the room that have made a huge difference to my family and my grandkids. And to me, I'd just like to single them out and dedicate this talk to them. Doug Monroe is the first one right over here. Many of you know Doug and what he's done for the community, what a great person he is. Another sitting, hiding back in the back is Tanya Carter, who's one of my favorite people. She runs the Children's Public Library. And they have made a huge difference to my grandchildren, Stuart and Robert, who spent a lot of time with both of them, actually. So I'd like to dedicate this talk to them. I'm so excited they're here, actually. Now, what I want to talk about today, there are a lot of things we could talk about the economy, because this is probably the most puzzling economy that we've seen, certainly in my lifetime, and I think in the lifetime of people who try to project it. You can see that every day if you watch the financial news or read the financial news. If you go on CNBC, you'll see people almost come to fisticuffs, and people always get angriest over things they don't know much about. That tends to stir a lot of resentment. But you'll see these battles playing out where people say, one group says, well, the stock market's headed straight up, and another group says, well, the stock market's headed straight down, and others say interest rates are on their way up, and others say the Fed's doing the right thing, it should raise rates more, and others say the Fed's doing the wrong thing. They're killing the economy, inflation's already coming down, and then you have others saying the opposite. So it's a puzzling time, I think, for the average citizen, and it's kind of in the nature of things. Now, I want to just focus on inflation. There are a lot of other things to talk about, but I think the most puzzling thing and the most important thing going on in the economy is inflation and the Federal Reserve's efforts to counteract it. Now let me go back and do just a brief history of inflation and how economists have thought about it. If a Martian landed in the U.S. today and somebody said, he overheard people talking about money, his first question would be, what do you mean by money? And if your answer was, well, that's what people used to pay their bills with, and then he followed people around, you'd get confused pretty quickly. You go to a restaurant and see people paying their bills, he wouldn't see anything about what we call money. He'd see people using credit cards and things like that. But if that same Martian happened to come to this country in, say, 1920, and so he asked what was money, he would see it. He would see people with coin and currency, maybe an occasional checking account. He wouldn't see any credit cards. So it was easy to pick out what you meant by money back in those days. If you go even further back into the 17th century, same thing was true. When people talked about money, they knew what it was, how to count it, how to describe it. Sometimes it was gold and silver. Sometimes it's what we call fiat money. But at least it was well known what money was. So in the 1970s, when inflation began to take off after the Vietnam War, there was a school of thought led by Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago that said inflation is just a monetary phenomenon. If you increase the money supply too fast, you get inflation, because after all, what's inflation? Inflation is the increase in the price of kind of everything in terms of your currency, in terms of the dollar. That's what inflation is. So if you flip it upside down, inflation is actually nothing more than the decline in the value of the dollar. So Friedman's argument was pretty simple. If you increase the supply of something a whole lot, its value will drop. And that was really, in simplistic terms, his argument why the money supply and its rapid expansion is what causes inflation. And for a long time, there was kind of a battle between Friedman and all of his critics as to whether that was true or not. And ultimately, Friedman won out. And Jimmy Carter, in 1979, listening to Friedman of all things, appointed Paul Volcker chairman of the Federal Reserve. And there's some people old enough to remember, I was on a trading floor when all this was taking place, I hate to confess, in my mid-30s. When Paul Volcker decided it was the money supply, he came in, became the Fed chairman, and promptly cranked down the money supply. He killed inflation, but in the process he killed the economy too. Inflation has gotten as bad as 14.6%. It has risen steadily from about 0.5% in the late 60s to 14.5% by late 1979. Volcker came in 79, crushed the economy by reducing the money supply enormously. And interest rates, we think 4% is a big number. I remember buying my grandmother the 14s of Novi 11. Now, what's the 14s of Novi 11? That's a 30-year Treasury bond that was issued in 1981. And for $100,000, you got paid $7,000 twice a year. $14,000 a year on a $100,000 investment. That's not bad, is it? So my grandmother always used to call me. I in those days worked on a trading floor in New York. And she'd call me and she'd say, you have to picture a trading floor in New York. You didn't have your own offices. You were right there in the midst of all these other people. And when the phone rang for you, it could be anybody on the whole trading floor picking it up. So I'd hear this, is there anyone on the floor named Buddy? That's my grandmother again. So I picked up the phone, and she'd say, I've saved up $10,000, what should I do? And I said, Grandma, there's an auction coming. The 30-year Treasury. I mean, you're only 93, so your expected life is another 40 or 50 years, so I think you should buy that. And my grandmother never questioned any of my advice, so she said, okay. So the following week, she did bid on it at auction. And she bought it at auction. And so a week went by, I sort of forgot about it. She called me up and she said, how's my bond doing? So I punched it up and it said 96. In other words, it was 100,000 now, or 10,000. Now it's 9,600. And I said, hell, it's doing fine, Grandma. And she said, exactly how is it doing? I said, Grandma, you know, it's 2:30, it's getting late in the day, I got all these trades to process. I'll call you right back. So a week later, she called again. And so this time it was down to 90 when she called. And I said, Grandma, it's doing great. I thought it's guaranteed by the U.S. government. You're just really doing well on this. Well, what's the price? Where's the price now? And I said, you know, there's not a phone ringing over here. And I've got to pick it up, but I'll be right back to you as soon as I get off the phone. So the following week, she called me up. And she said, buddy, I looked in the paper. I found my bond. And at the very end of the row, it said 84. And I said, Grandma, bonds have CUSIP numbers. That's how we identify them in Wall Street. I think she knew all along what was going on here. But that 30-year bond traded down to 17.6% yield. 17.6% yield. And it was 6 weeks after it was auctioned. So we haven't seen anything like the high rates that we saw then. Prime rate went above 20, the overnight interest rates went above 20, but it killed the inflation of the 70s. And it made prominent the idea that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. People heralded Paul Volcker and what he did. Now what happened is, after that period, after 1985, there was never a real tie between the money growth rate and inflation anymore. Ben Bernanke's famous quantitative easing from 09 to 19 involved an average increase in the money supply of 5.8% a year. That was the average. Well, over a period of 10 years, that raised the money supply by 80%, and yet interest rates stayed at zero. And inflation went nowhere. That totally undermined the idea that there's some simple connection between money growth and inflation. And it taught a generation of economists that whatever is causing inflation, it is not excess money growth. And that view is still implanted in the minds of virtually every academic economist. Now what changed and what became the view is that inflation is just an overheated economy. That when the economy overheats, then you're going to get inflation, and if the economy is weak, you won't. That became the standard view. It is the view of the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board today, Powell. But let's look at some of the data. I'm going to show you a few charts here, and we'll skip through these really quickly. But they all have one thing in common. If you look at the chart, to the right end of the chart, there's a dramatic jump about the time of the pandemic. Everything changes in early 2020. That's when the pandemic was announced. If you recall, Trump was in the White House at the time. That's when the closures began, in late February of 2020. So let's take a look at this data here. This is the real economy. And you can see it was doing little or nothing coming into the pandemic. And then the economy was closed. Now, it's very difficult to measure GDP when the economy is closed. For example, government expenditures showed output in education, even though all the schools were closed. So if you corrected for things that really didn't exist anymore, if you went to the DMV to get your driver's license renewed, how was that? That was closed as well. So a lot of things that are counted as government in this, really, there was no output at all. But in any event, the economy began to recover. But here's the things that happened. The national debt absolutely exploded. In 2019, the national debt, funded and unfunded, was $20 trillion. That was about the size of the economy, 21 trillion. Today it's 31.5 trillion. It was increased by over 50% in just 2 years, 2 short years. Now what you see in this diagram is the projected from CBO and Peterson's Institute. Where the dotted line is, that's where we are. And you can see the percentage is about what it was in World War II, percentage of debt to GDP. But in World War II, when we had this huge deficit and big national debt, the way we solved that is we quit building planes, tanks, and armaments. We don't have any easy solutions like that now, because most of this debt is piled up in a different way. Look at this picture. Now this is really the tale of today's lecture, this picture. You can see money supply growing throughout the Ben Bernanke quantitative easing years. And it starts, let's see, how do I do this? Look at that. Whoa, hold on a second. Okay. Oh, I had it. There we go. Starts right here. This is the 08-09 crash, and now all of a sudden the quantitative easing period. And this is the period where the average growth in the money supply was about 5.8%. Now, the reason the money supply grew is that the government was selling a lot of debt, and the number one buyer was the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve, which can create money out of whole cloth, it just makes a digital entry, and there it is. You don't have to use a printing press anymore. You just punch a button. It's really a great system. Wish I was the Federal Reserve. My life would be so different. Can you imagine? Well, I think I need $1 trillion today. Just press this button. But you can see something dramatic happened in 2020. Notice what happens to the curve here. This is bad enough. But this period was with no inflation, zero interest rates practically. 2 years ago, the yield on a one-year Treasury bill was 0.11%. Today it's right at 5%. So interest rates were very, very low. And this was all done because the Federal Reserve was buying government debt and putting money into the system. That's where the money growth came from. It was the action of the central bank as the national government sold debt. The Federal Reserve stepped in and bought it. And what did it use for money? Digital money, just created out of whole cloth. And the numbers are staggering. At the time of the 2008 collapse, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was about $380 billion. By the time they got through this episode, it was $9.1 trillion. So most of the money supply creation came by the Fed, quote, expanding its balance sheet. And you can see what it did here. Now there's the money supply, which had been clipping along at a reasonable rate, and then all of a sudden, straight up. Notice all these charts have the same picture on the far right, straight up. So the money supply went from, it was roughly 14.5 trillion. Now you might ask, my wife always says, when you give these talks, why don't you define what you mean by the money supply? So why don't I do that for a second? I mean all the coin and currency held outside of the banking system, plus all the checking accounts and savings accounts in the banking system. That's so-called M2 money supply. So it's checking accounts, roughly speaking, including savings accounts, plus coin and currency you've got in your pockets. That's the M2 money supply. There's an M1 and an M2 and an M3 and an M8 and an M18, just a million definitions. But M2 is the most widely used. So this is what happened to M2. Now you can see the inflection point in 2020. Now, by the time you get to 2022, everything that you see in that chart is there. And the two probably most important economists in the country at the time in 2021, in late 2021, are Janet Yellen, who works for Biden, and Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Both of those economists, and Janet Yellen, sometimes people attack Janet Yellen, she doesn't know what she's doing. It's ridiculous. Janet Yellen's one of the most brilliant academic economists in the world. She was a student of James Tobin at Yale. Everybody in the world wanted her. We did at Cornell. I was teaching at Cornell and tried actively to recruit her. Don't let that Brooklyn accent fool you. She's a smart woman. But her prediction on inflation was that there would be no inflation. She was absolutely dead wrong. And Jay Powell was worse. In August of 2021, when measured inflation was already above 6%, Jay Powell said it was transitory and it would be a mistake to do anything about it. That's a year and a half ago. That's 16, 17 months ago when the Fed chairman said there's no inflation in this economy and we're not going to do anything about it. Now, that's in the face of this. Now, he gave a talk, an important talk at Jackson Hole in August of 2021. And there was 15 pages of economic data to support his view that there was no inflation. 15 pages. How many of them mentioned the Fed balance sheet or the money supply? Zero. There wasn't a single mention of the money supply. So the view is that you can do whatever you want with the money supply. Now, a preliminary version of this paper I'm going to be giving in Australia coming up in April. I'm giving a paper in Australia to the economics group. I gave the paper at the Virginia Economic Association, and the Federal Reserve had 6 research assistants in the audience. And I sort of attacked the Fed in the paper, and I asked them, doesn't this suggest something to you? If you've restricted the output of every good in the U.S. economy except one thing, and you increased its supply 50%, what would you predict? What would be the Economics 101 prediction? That one thing should lose its value. Now, I wrote an article that was published in February or April of 2020, before all of this, right about here, and predicted that inflation was coming and it was going to be pretty tough. I think they have copies of the article back there. Let's do a couple more of these pictures. So there's inflation. Now, at the time I wrote the article, inflation wasn't doing much of anything. It actually was negative. But then it gradually took off and peaked in the summer of 2020, almost at the exact same time Powell was saying that it wasn't a problem, it was transitory. It peaked at 9%. And then Powell announced in December of 2021 that they were going to pivot. They recognized that inflation was a problem. December of 2021 was 13 months ago, 14 months ago. But he said he wasn't going to do anything till March, so they continued to buy U.S. Treasuries all the way up to March 15th. And they didn't do anything about rates at all. And so finally, in March of 15, the Federal Reserve began this process. So now you have a variety of schools of thought. Powell now knows that inflation is embedded in the system. We found that out last week when the PCE numbers came out, well above expectation. They had expected PCE to come out at 0.2%, 0.2 for the month. That's roughly a 3% annualized rate. It came out 3 times as high at 0.6. And even the core rate came out at 0.6, which was predicted much lower. So we now know that inflation is truly embedded in this system. So the question is this a monetary phenomenon or not? Now, to this day, the Federal Reserve says money doesn't matter. But this has nothing to do with the cranking up of the money supply. And they look at the unemployment rate. They argue that this is an overheated economy. This is not an overheated economy. But that is the argument of the Federal Reserve, that we have an overheated economy. And so they watch the unemployment rate. And as long as the unemployment rate is low, they see that as inflation. So those are the different views. Let me kind of summarize these views. The consensus view behind the Federal Reserve policy is that excess demand causes inflation. And whatever the Fed does with the money supply doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference at all. They can do whatever they want with the money supply. Now, I asked the head of Richmond Federal Reserve research guy. I asked him a couple of unfriendly questions. I'm a banker here. I'll ask him the question. So, if you can increase the money supply by $7.5 trillion in 1 year, and you don't get any inflation, then it's all real wealth, right? Has to be. Has to be all real wealth. People hold it. It's sitting in people's pockets. If there's no inflation, if you can really do that, if you can really take the money into supply from 14.5 trillion to 22 without inflation, then it's real wealth, isn't it? Well, why are we working? The annual tax bite in this country is roughly around 4.7 trillion. Why don't the Fed just print up 4.7 trillion and pay all the government's bills? That was one of the friendly questions I asked the head of research at the Federal Reserve. And he said, well, I hadn't thought about that. And I said, why haven't you thought about that? Don't you work on inflation? He said, no, it's not one of the things I work on. Pretty interesting. Right there. And I said, what do you work on? He said, I'm working on discrepancies in the mortgage market in the 1930s. So then I thought I'd ask him a friendlier question. Well, what if we just double the money supply every week? That's not going to have any impact either? Because none of your models, it has no impact in any of the Fed models. None. None of the Fed models have the money supply in them, which is nice, because the Fed can just do whatever it wants. So that's the state of the art. Now, having said all this, I've got to caution all of you that the state of academic research on inflation is not good. And I do not have a accepted theory of inflation. I can tell you what I think, but I am now entering the academic wars with this point of view. I'm chairing the session of the Western Economic Association, the largest academic meeting in the world, in Melbourne, Australia, coming up in April. And I will present my views at that meeting. And what they are is that at the end of the day, inflation has always been a monetary phenomenon. There's never been a period of inflation in the history of the world that wasn't preceded by heavy money growth. There are no examples. None. And to argue that you can analyze inflation without any concern about money growth or the expansion of the money supply is a mistake. And to argue that the current economy is overheated doesn't pass the laugh test. This is not an overheated economy. It may have a low unemployment rate because a lot of people have pulled out of the workforce, but it's not an overheated economy by any stretch of the imagination. So I think what Powell was doing by raising overnight rates and raising rates is he's doing some damage to the economy, but it won't affect inflation much. Now they are beginning to lower the Fed balance sheet, and money growth is beginning to fall. And I read a paper by a modern-day Friedman guy in the Wall Street Journal the other day, and he said money supply is dropping precipitously. Well, it is. It's down 3% this year, but it went up 41% in the previous 16 months. So it's got a long way to drop before you take it out. So, you ready for some predictions? All right, let me give you my prediction. But I have to warn you that at this point, there's a great deal of disagreement among academic economists. What is the right way to go here? And the best in the business subscribe to the Fed's theory. The best in the business being Janet Yellen and others. They are the top academic economists in the field of money in the world. I think they're all wrong, but I can't throw darts at them. It's not being confident, because they are very confident, perhaps much more so than I am. But with that said, the forecast is that much of the stimulus money is still out there. It has not been spent, and that's why the economy is not slowing down. And it will not slow down much during the course of the year. The economy will stay strong during the balance of 2023 and maybe even into 2024. You can see it everywhere. The University of Virginia still got stimulus money. It's never even been close to spending. We've got hundreds of millions of dollars yet to spend. The state of Virginia has $2 billion left over in its coffers that it got through these federal packages. There's money to be spent that has not come out and hit the economies yet. So the economy will do well, but inflation will continue. And probably over the next 2 years, will average probably in the 7-8% area. That's pretty scary, isn't it? Now let me tell you the consensus view so you don't walk away getting scared. All the smart people, they say inflation's over. It'll be 2.5% by year end. It'll be 2% next year. This is the opinion of Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve and all the top economists. They say there's some danger the economy will weaken, but now there's currently a view that it's not going to be a hard landing or a soft landing. The new lingo is it's going to be no landing. We're going to get through this fine. And I think the point of this talk is that all these charts that I'm showing you are pretty extreme. Had we just had a mild fiscal response to the pandemic, a lot of that would have been true. But we had a response to the pandemic that was World War II type size, and it happened globally. The European Union did the same thing. The amount of sovereign debt in the world trying to get financed now is unbelievable, and rates are flying everywhere in the world, including in Europe as well as the U.S. So it was really the size of the pandemic response that created this problem. And Bernanke came out with a book recently trying to describe why he did QE. And I was very curious why he did the quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is when the Fed buys government debt, puts money in the system. He said it was to keep rates low. Well, maybe that was the plan all along, that they monetized all the debt so that the rates wouldn't go up at the time they sold all the debt. The extra $11.5 trillion that they sold just in the last 2 years. But sooner or later, there's no free lunch in any of this. All the monetization means there's going to be more inflation, but the economy will be a little bit stronger than they think. All right, with all the appropriate caveats, those are my predictions about where we're headed. We're headed to more inflation, higher rates. I'm sorry, who's refinancing? Higher rates, and an economy that will clip right on through to the end of the year and stay pretty good. Now, all of you live in this area. This area is going to be hot relatively anyway, because the world is moving out of big cities, not only in the U.S., but globally. And it's moving to places like right here, amazingly enough. I see it even from Charlottesville. Many of my Charlottesville friends, just even in the last 6 months, have moved here, right here. So good things will happen to all of you good people here in Lancaster County. But at some point, there'll be a day of reckoning on the inflation front. Thank every one of you for being here.
We've got a microphone for questions, and Dr. Burton is available to answer these questions. So who's got a...
Can you tell us how to take money out of the economy? You told us how the government clicked the button and gave us money. How do you take money out of the economy?
What they're doing is they're letting the debt run off. In other words, they have an enormous number of treasury bills and governments and mortgage backs. And if you let them run off, it sounds like it has no impact. But for example, if you have a 3-month treasury bill, you just let it go off. But the government has to replace that money.
Dr. Burton, if you'll hold the mic to answer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hello? The question was, how is the Fed reducing the money supply? And what they're doing is they're letting their balance sheet roll off. So they have 3-month treasuries, they have other dated securities, they have mortgage backs. So imagine a 3-month treasury bill just rolling off. In other words, you get and it just goes away. But the government has to replace that. The fiscal authorities have to replace that money because they've got to pay that treasury bill off. So they have to replace it. So the debt stays there, it's just the money supply falls. It's just the reverse of what they did first. What they've been doing is selling government securities. And the government security market is kind of a mess because there are 4 big buyers the last 10 years. The biggest buyer has been the Federal Reserve. They're no longer buying, they're selling. The second biggest buyer is the American banking system. They're no longer buying, they're selling. Third biggest buyer is Japan. They're no longer buying, they're selling. The fourth biggest buyer was China. They're no longer buying, they're selling. So it's getting very difficult to finance the national debt. And that's what you're seeing in the rise in 10-year yields, 30-year yields, and resulting mortgages as well. So they're going the other way, but they're doing it very slowly. And I know what's going to happen here. They're going to get concerned about the auctions. So they're going to abandon that policy. They're going to come back and buy these securities again. That's what they'll do. And there are hints of it. Whenever you hear or read about the illiquidity of the Treasury market, you read stories like that, that means they're having trouble selling the debt. That's what it means. And so when that happens, they'll reverse this policy of letting the debt roll off. And then what you'll have is just a kind of a long-run higher inflation regime.
Hey, Dr. Burton. So right now, crypto is really just more of a financial asset, speculative investment, I guess.
But the guy asking this question ran fixed income for the Virginia retirement system for about 20 years. He knows more about the debt market than I'll ever know. Go ahead.
Thank you. If crypto ever becomes a real medium of exchange, not just a speculative investment like it is right now, how do you think that will impact inflation? It's another currency that's sort of in the U.S. economy that's competing for U.S. goods. I get it that it's converted to dollars, but there must be some impact on cryptocurrency on inflation. And is there any studies done along those lines?
That's an interesting way to put the question. Of all the questions you get about crypto, I didn't anticipate one about inflation.
Right.
Let me say this, I don't know the answer to the question you raised, so when I don't know the answer to the question raised, I'll just answer a different question.
You want me to ask a fixed income?
This is the different question. Is crypto a good idea or a bad idea? There's a big debate about all that. You find good people on both sides of that debate. You find competent people on both sides of that. On both sides of that debate, on the crypto debate. Crypto is attractive mainly because of the blockchain technology. That's what makes the Shark Tank guy, what's his name, Mr. Wonderful? He's in there. It's the blockchain technology, which is an encryption technology, a security device, encryption. And for that, it has value as an encryption technology. It also has value. I remember one of my students said, Professor Burton, you're so old-fashioned, you don't like crypto. I said, tell me one advantage of crypto. He said, well, what if you're running a business and you want to pay your employees every second? I said, well, I guess if I wanted to do that, yeah, that'd be handy. But who in the world wants to do that? So most of the things people tell me they can do with crypto, if I ran the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, I guess you could see an advantage to crypto, right? If you're a drug dealer, great. But I don't have any trouble paying bills with the existing mechanism. I'm not sure everybody desperately needs a new method of payment. And the original idea was, hey, the dollar is all over the map. We're going to create cryptocurrency because that'll be stable. That won't move around very much. And I think we've kind of blown that idea to smithereens. So, but my students, I do have some of my students, some of my favorite students who like crypto. So maybe I'm old-fashioned, I just don't get it yet. But to me, I feel like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and all these guys. Cryptos.
Well, I'm right there with you. For what it's worth.
Brian Gardner is the person in the back of the room. For many years, I served on the Virginia Retirement System Board, and he ran the fixed income part of the state system for many, many years. He's a very talented guy and knows a lot more about fixed income than I do.
I just wanted to sort of understand the whole thing that you're talking about. I think you're describing to me what I'm understanding, open market operations.
Yes, ma'am.
The buying and selling of securities. My understanding is that, like on Wednesday, there was an adjustment to the federal funds rate, And that is the main way that Mr. Powell is trying to beat inflation. Is that an effective way to do it?
No, I don't think it has much to do with inflation. If they could kill the economy, you still have inflation. There's somehow a view that you can't have inflation even if the economy is weak. The 1970s are an obvious testament that that's wrong. Inflation and unemployment grew steadily through the 70s. And unemployment, in fact, peaked at 11% by 1981, but it went up throughout that decade in the face of big inflation. And for some reason, people think that inflation is good for the economy. If you have deflation, it's not good. You know, the best economic growth in America, which took America from a backwater at the end of the Civil War to 1913, was deflation. The whole period was deflation. That's where William Jennings Bryan came from. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. Free and unlimited coinage of silver, 16 to 1. That was a plea to increase the money supply. So there's no evidence that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment or any of that. The evidence isn't there, and you have periods like the 70s where it just wasn't true. And we're having it right now. The economy is, to say, people that believe it's weakening, inflation's still there. It hasn't gone away. It may have peaked at 9% last year, but the last reading last month was annualized 7.2%. So inflation's still here. Here, let me make one bold prediction, by the way. I make this one on the radio. I'm on the radio every week in Charlottesville. The housing market's going to do fine. You keep reading that the housing market's not going anywhere. Think about that a minute. There is no supply of housing. There isn't here in this county. And there isn't anywhere. There's none in Charlottesville. Housing prices do well in inflation. That's the problem with inflation. Here's the problem with inflation. The world is divided into people that have assets and people that don't. People that don't get no protection when inflation hits. They just get annihilated. And people that have assets often do well because everything's going up. There are people in this room, I'm sure, who are a lot better off financially today than they were 3 years ago. Well, think about it. You own a bunch of houses and other things. Really, even stocks haven't even gone down. If you go back for 3 years, stocks are up. Even though they had a bad 2022. The stock market is so much better than anybody says. If you had bought stocks at the absolute peak in August of 2007, and you had 14,000 in the Dow, and then the market crashed and the Dow went down to 6,000, today the Dow's 33,000 after a big hit. It's not bad, 14,000 to 33,000. I like that, particularly with all the bad news the market's gotten. But anyway, the point of your question is the Fed policy of raising the overnight funds rate, is that a good way to beat inflation? We've had periods where there are no central banks. America had no central bank until 1913. We grew right through the 19th century without a Fed, without a central bank, without anybody. And anytime inflation reared its head, guess what? Rates went up. Anytime inflation went down, guess what? Rates went down. If we had no Fed today, given the inflation we have, rates would be up anyway. It's not totally clear the Fed isn't just following the market. I was struck when I was in Wall Street during the Volcker years. I ran the derivatives business for Smith Barney, and right next to us was a government securities business. And I got to know them. The bill trader was a good friend of mine. And the way Wall Street works is, this bill trader was a nice guy, he was happy trading bills all day long, except when he had a big loss, he put his head down on the desk and started crying. So my job, as a friend of the guy that ran that department, was to take Rick's name was Rick Lang, take him outside, and walk around the block a few times. And then they'd close out all his positions and come back in. And then he'd feel great. He didn't have the positions anymore. They'd taken the loss, and Rick was right back in business. And about every 3 months, I had to do this chore. I was taking care of Rick. But I would pay attention to what Volcker said. And every time he raised the overnight funds rate, every time, and remember, he raised the overnight funds rate all the way to 18. He would say, I'm just following the market. And he did it every time, and I was struck by that comment. What does he mean? He's just following the market. At the end of the day, why would you expect the central bank to be able to control that rate? anytime you have inflation, rates go up. Anywhere in the world, whether they have a central bank or not, it always has happened that way. And when inflation goes down, rates go down. So I think what the Fed does can be overrated. They're simply a central bank. But what they do with the money supply, that can have huge impacts. And I have suggested that I think the right policy is to continue, you're not going to like this, but continue to expand the Fed balance sheet, but slower. And just live with 4, 5, 6 years of inflation and bring inflation down to zero and try your best to avoid an economic collapse. I think if you try to bring the money supply down too quickly, you'll have a big repeat of what happened in 1981. When the economy, there are plenty of you old enough to remember that, because some of you are not too much younger than I am, right? Don't raise your hand. Doug, how about you? He raised his hand. Well, I remember it very clearly, and so.
22% housing loan.
What was that?
22% construction loan.
Yeah, let me come back to the housing market, because people talk about a 7% mortgage rate and all that. People were taking out mortgages at 18% in 1979, not thinking anything about it. What encourages people to take out mortgage rates is not their level, but what they think the home prices are going to do. If they think home prices are going to be going up 10% a year, they don't care about a 7% mortgage rate or an 8% mortgage rate. So I think you're going to see housing do well. I think home prices will continue to do well. And in an area like this, let's face it, you're a luxury good. You live in an unbelievably great community. People die to get into this community. And a lot of my friends have just recently, sorry, didn't mean to use that expression. But you're in the sweet spot, right here in Lancaster County. Are there any real estate people in the audience?
I'm in real estate.
Do you disagree with what I'm saying?
I'm in the commercial space.
Oh, you're in commercial, forget that.
You got hard assets.
Now, commercial, a little bit different story, but I think residential is going to do well. Right now, there was a story that came out the other day about home prices fell by $2 trillion or something in value across the country. And if you look inside the story, they fell in 2 states. And they were up in every other state. Do I have to tell you who the 2 states are? New York and California. Yeah, they're cratering in New York and California, but they are doing great in this community, in my community in Charlottesville. My daughter's been trying to buy a house in Charlottesville for the last 2 years. And she's not getting anywhere. Believe me, you talk to buyers and sellers, buyers are still struggling to buy houses. It's still tough and it'll stay tough. And that's what happened in the 70s. If you can remember back in the 70s, the only asset that worked was your home. That's what went up. The other assets, the stocks were kind of mixed all during that period. Raw land does pretty well. Stocks won't fall apart. They won't. Because inflation can be kind of almost quasi-neutral to stocks. The damage that inflation does is poor people with no assets get devastated. Because they're the ones paying the price of food and shelter and all that. And they don't have other assets to protect them. And that's why there's a big hue and cry about inflation. Inflation hurts people in the lower middle income and the bottom. It doesn't much affect people at the top that much because they have assets that offset it frequently. So inflation, they're going to have to tackle inflation. I would tackle it slowly over a period of time. You created this nightmare by the size of what we did. So I think you need to just kind of slow the money growth down over time. You're going to live with a lot of inflation. But if you kill inflation, like they're thinking about trying to do, you're going to hurt a lot of people in the process.
Another question?
You partially answered my question, but the Fed's mandate is 2% inflation. That's the mandate, right? That's the official.
Yes.
And there's talk about
Target.
maybe raising it 2.8, something like that.
Right.
A lot of people think there's already been a de facto abandonment of the 2%, now 2.8. But given your outlook for inflation and given the Fed's current mandate, doesn't that implies that the Fed It's going to have to keep rates higher than expected for longer than expected. Given that scenario, do you see hard landing or soft landing or no landing? Where are you?
If they keep the current policy, you're going to have a very hard landing, but I don't think they'll be able to keep the current policy. We look back, by the way, at the Fed's ability to predict inflation. We look back to 2009 to see what they predicted. They make their predictions every December for the coming year. So they predicted 2% for 2010 and 09, 2% for the next year, 2% for the next year. In other words, wherever their target is, that's what they predicted every year. So they got to 2020, after all these numbers had gotten big. So what did they predict for 2021? Inflation. 1.6. It was running at 4 when they made the prediction. Now, what did they predict at the end of 2022? I'm sorry, 2021. What was their prediction for 2021? In 2020, they predicted 1.6, and you ended up with 6. In 2021, they predicted 2.6. They raised it. You ended up with 7.5. They are terrible at predictions, which raises the question: if you're the governmental body whose job is to curb inflation, how good are you going to be if your prediction is 20% of the actual value? And what we show in the paper, this paper that's heading to Melbourne, is that the better predictor is somebody who just says last year's rate will be next year's rate. That guy slaughters the Fed. It's not even close. Fed is just terrible at predicting the one thing it's supposed to be managing, the rate of inflation. They've just been wrong. So,
What you haven't talked about is the political component. There's got to be one. I mean, if Janet Yellen is brilliant and can't see what you see, and she's a political appointee.
maybe I'm wrong. That's all.
Okay, well, I don't know. You're very convincing. So in here, but I mean, some of these people you've been talking about are political appointees, or they're in political positions. Is this affecting the way they address the problem?
You mentioned Janet Yellen, who I obviously have a lot of respect for. Can you all hear me on this?
Yeah.
I think if you're working for an administration, whether it's Trump, Biden, or anybody else, you're going to be careful about departing too far from the party line. I know I was asked a question about a sales tax rebate on the radio, which Governor Youngkin had proposed, and I came out against it. I said it's a gimmick, it shouldn't be done, and then I got a call from Youngkin's office appointing me as their economic advisor. You must not have been listening to the radio. Well, I thought it was a gimmick. I didn't think, it was a great idea. That's a good question, but this is a bipartisan thing because Trump was in the White House when this first started. And he was the one with the Democratic Party together who put through the $1.9 trillion package that was funded by money growth. And so he knew that. And he's the one that appointed Powell as well. And of course, Powell was reappointed by Joe Biden. So I don't think you can say that one party is right and the other party is wrong on this. I mean, I'm a partisan. I have strong political views, but I honestly don't think on this there's a right and wrong party as much as maybe a right and wrong policy. And again, I got to counter that. These people, Janet Yellen, if she was here, would defend herself, right? She's not here. It's very easy to sit here and throw darts at Janet Yellen, but if she were here, it'd be a different story.
Could it possibly have a psychological component where they realize perhaps it would be a 7% inflation rate, but if the Fed comes out and says that, maybe that would make it an even larger rate?
But you raised an interesting issue. You doing okay? Y'all all right? We're all still here? Okay. One of my favorite people sitting over here. I have to check on him once in a while. I'm sorry, help me here. The question was? Psychological. The Fed spends a lot of time talking about managing inflationary expectations, that they're very worried that inflation, well, the expectations will take off and get embedded in people's mind. And they've been attacked for that by, of all people, a guy who works at the Fed, 30-year veteran in the Fed, says they should quit talking about inflationary expectations. That's not what's causing the inflation. And I think that's right. It wasn't the case that sometime in 2020 we all just decided, hey, inflation's going to go to 5%. That's not what happened. Inflation took off and then our expectations adjusted to the rate of inflation. That's how expectations occur. And I think too often Powell seems to think if he can just say it the right way, people will believe inflation's going away. But that's not economic policy. Inflation's not going to go away because I say it's going away or somebody else says it's going away. It's not that kind of thing. If you double the money supply every 5 minutes, is it really going to matter how you describe it? It's not going to make any difference. And that's the problem they have. Again, the problem they have is the size of what they did. Had they done a much smaller package, we'd be talking about something very different. But it's the size of the, and there was, by the time, it was bad enough in the Trump years, but when Biden comes in, now all of a sudden just Katie bar the door, $2 trillion here, $2 trillion, this is just a $20 trillion economy. You cannot spend an extra $11, $12 trillion. Just imagine on taking your income and deciding one year, well, I'll just spend, that much and more. That's what they did, and they didn't spend it in a very good way either. The money that went out, and I have an elderly sister, and I noticed that her account got flooded with checks because she had a Social Security number, and the checks just came rolling in. Nobody asked her what her financial situation, doesn't work or anything. I look after her. All her bills are paid by me, so that's all right. Do something. So I guess I got it. I sit on the board of a money management company that received a huge payment from the stimulus thing. And we had the best year we've ever had in 2020. Far and away. 2020 was a great year in the money management business. It was great. And what did we get? We doubled our revenue because the government was kind enough to send us a check. Thank you. So a lot of it wasn't targeted well, didn't get to poor people. Poor people didn't even know how to go about it. Many of these things are supposed to help poor people. Next time somebody says, I'm going to do this to help poor people, run for the nearest hills because these programs often don't help poor people. Poor people are not reading the paper, following all the stuff, filling out the paper. My sister's on Medicare, and so those of you who are on Medicare or have been helping you on Medicaid, try figuring all that stuff out. Oh my goodness, it's an endless battle dealing with bureaucracies over all these things that are supposed to help poor people. So anyway, that was supposed to help poor people, but they're finding out now, you're going to be reading stories about how so much of it just was doled out to whoever could figure out how to beat the system. So it didn't even accomplish any of that, but the biggest problem was it was too big. Whatever you might think of all these stimulus packages, they were just too big. The country can't afford it. There are limits to what you can do. And now you're going to pay for it, one way or another. You're going to pay for it in higher inflation. You're going to pay for it in maybe an economy that has to get crushed to beat the inflation. There's not some magic wand where we have a soft landing and we just go right on. If that were the case, why do we tax anybody? Why are we paying taxes? $4.5 trillion, nothing. Just let the Fed pay out $4.5 trillion in new money every year, and we don't have to pay taxes, right? If this works, it's the same thing. It's actually smaller. We spend more money than if we had just not had a pandemic and just paid all the government bills by printing money and not taxing anybody. That sounds like a great idea to me. I'm all for it. So you can see I'm not all for it. Yes.
Would it be fair to say that a good analogy is if you're in the wild horse business and the economy turns down, you don't go buying more wild horses because you can only tame one at a time?
That's a pretty good analogy, I would say. There's a limit to all the things we can do with the government. And sometimes we just have to figure out ways to do it without the government because there's not an unlimited checkbook here. And we acted like there was an unlimited checkbook, and now those resources are, a lot of them are all gone. And now we've got to pay for them, because if it were that easy, if there was going to be no inflation or just a little bit, we've had so far a 14% increase in the price level. That's to be matched up against a 50% increase in the supply of money. Those two numbers imply more inflation is coming. The price level still has further to go on the upside. If it doesn't, that'd be great. That'd be news I'd love to hear. That'd be wonderful. That means we can just print our way and we can all stay home and eat caviar. I mentioned caviar. When I was a young kid, I always dreamed I could get rich, and there were two things I wanted to be able to afford. Can you guess what they are? Oysters and caviar. Well, when we first moved to the area, I went over to Kellum's to see what oysters were. A dozen for $6. I couldn't believe it. I bet they're not that anymore. But they were that when I first moved here. I still can't afford caviar. I don't know that Jeff Bezos can afford caviar.
So on that happy news, I want to thank you so much for coming and giving us your insights on the economy. And all I can say is, I hope you're wrong, but I fear you're right. So, and with that, if you'll stay and entertain any other questions with the group as we adjourn for coffee and cookies.
Thank you all for being here. It's great fun for me to be